In this lesson, we'll learn about volumetric lighting using Octane Fog Volume. We can use it to simulate light scattered by atmosphere in the scene to add a foggy atmosphere to the lighting or create God rays and similar effects. I'll walk you through working with the basics of fog volume in Octane with a simple scene. Then we'll take what we have learned to a more complex scene to light a very moody scene. Let me start a render in the live viewer. Hey folks, welcome to Mograph Plus. This video is a free sample from our course, The Ultimate Introduction to Octane For Cinema 4D. It's a massive 20-hour long course in which we explore all the aspects of Octane For Cinema 4D thoroughly. Make sure to check it out, the link is in the description. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest videos. So this is a very basic scene. I have a huge disk that works as the floor and a 75 centimeters cube. For the lighting, I'm using a rectangular analytic area light. Currently, the spread angle is set to 180 degrees. Now, from the Objects menu, add an Octane Fog Volume. You see something has been added to the scene, even though it's a bit hard to see. Let me close the live viewer and see what we have in the viewport. So we have added this volume object to the scene. You see this green cube that is the container for the volume. The volume object is also used to render fire, smoke, clouds too. We will learn about that probably in the last section of the course. Here we just want to learn how to use it to create volumetric lighting. So we need to make sure the volume container encompasses the entire area that we want to have the volumetric lighting. In this case, I wanted to include the light source, the cube, and a few meters around them. So let's start to make the container bigger in the viewport. As I start to make the container a bit bigger, I notice it starts to lag and slow down. The reason being is that the volume contains voxels or 3D pixels. Right now, if you go to the Attribute Manager and come over to the Generate tab of the volume, the voxel size is set to 5 centimeters. Each voxel can contain information to render the volume, information like density, temperature, and the more voxels we have, the more VRAM we need to store them. And for volumetric lighting and atmospheric effects, we don't need very small voxels. So let's set the voxel size to around 50 centimeters. Now, if I start making the volume bigger in the viewport, it will be much snappier. And the small planes in the viewport represent the voxel size. It's a bit distracting to see them in the viewport, so let's change the display type under the Generate tab to None. Now we only see the container without the voxels in the viewport. Instead of the viewport, you can control the size of the volume container using the size parameters on X, Y, and Z. Let's set the size on X to 830 centimeters, on Y to 600 centimeters, and on Z to 1850 centimeters. And now we can change the position of the volume container as I wish. Let me just go to the Container tab, set position X and Z to 0 and position Y to 230 centimeters. Now, as you can see, the container encompasses the light source and the cube fairly well, and a few meters behind the cube where the light will shine. Now let's get back to the camera and start a render in the live viewer. You can see the volume is so dense that it blocks the light completely. And to fix that, let's go to the Medium tab of the volume. You notice we have a volume medium node connected to the volume medium input of the fog volume object. Let's go inside the volume medium. The first parameter here is density, which is set to 100. So imagine each voxel right now has an attribute called density, and the amount for that attribute is 100. Let's set it to 1. Now we kind of start to see something, but it is still very dense. Let's lower it to 0.1. Now we start to see the light source, the cube, and how the light source illuminates the volume and scatters through it. To see the effect better, let's select the light tag, enable normalize power, lower the spread angle to 40 degrees, and decrease power to around 50. And now we get this beautiful volumetric lighting. Now let's go to the second camera. From this view, we can see where the volumetric lighting gets cut off, especially if I increase the power of the light source to around 300. You notice around here behind the cube. And this is where the container no longer exists. If we want, we can make the container a bit bigger so it won't get cut off for a longer distance. Let's increase the Z size to 2300s. Let's lower the power back to around 50 as well. One of the first things I need to solve is the amount of noise around where the scattering happens, and an easy solution would be to lower the GI clamp value in the Octane settings window under the kernels tab. So let's go to the Octane settings window, and under the kernels tab, find the GI clamp parameter. By default, it is set to 1 million. Something around 10 would be enough for most scenes, and for a scene like that, even something like 5 or even lower, like 2 would be enough. Let's set it to 5 for now. Now you notice how the noise around the main light shaft is cleaned up faster. We will talk about GI clamp in more detail in the rendering section of the course, but as you know me, I hate to tell you just to push a button without giving you an explanation of what that button does. GI stands for global illumination or indirect lighting. GI clamp allows you to define an energy limit for the indirect light rays. So right now the GI clamp is set to 5. We are asking Octane to terminate any indirect ray that has a bigger value or energy than 5. If I set the GI clamp to 0, we no longer have any indirect lighting. As soon as a light ray hits the first surface on its way from the light source, it will illuminate that surface and then will be killed off. Because currently the GI clamp is set to 0, and obviously a direct light ray after hitting a surface will become an indirect light ray and would bounce back and forth and have an energy level higher than 0. But because the GI clamp is set to 0, that ray will be killed off after hitting the first surface. So in this scene, because we don't really need that much indirect lighting, we can lower the GI clamp to something like 2 or even 1. Let's set it to 2 in this case. For more detailed explanation, check out the rendering section of the course. If I select the light tag and go to the light settings tab, there is this parameter called visible on scattering volume. If I disable it, the light no longer affects the volume. You can use this option to determine if a light affects volumes or not. I wish this was a slider so we could determine how much a light affects volumes. For now, it's just a switch to turn it on and off. For now, let's just have it enabled. For now, let's select the volume again and go to the Generate tab. One parameter that can be very useful here is the texture input. Right now, all the voxels have the exact same density. Because of the directional light source, we are scattering light through some of the voxels and see them manifest through the light shaft. We can modulate the density of the voxels with a 3D texture like a noise. Where the noise is white or has a higher value, the voxel there would have a higher density. And where the noise is black or has a lower value, the voxel would have a lower density. So let's add a Cinema 4D noise to the texture input. You have to use the Cinema 4D, the native Cinema 4D noise, and not an Octane noise, because Octane textures are GPU textures and noise is a CPU texture. And for these kind of effects, we need CPU textures. So Cinema 4D and Octane can work together. Now, let's go inside the noise, change the noise type to Naki, and to add a bit contrast, let's increase the low clip to 35% and lower the high clip to 65%. Now we can clearly see a 3D noise pattern modulating the density of the voxels. We can go to the other camera as well to see it from that view. Let's get back to our main camera and also remove the noise from the texture input. Now let's come over to the medium tab, and here we have a volume medium node connected to the volume medium input of the fog volume. There are other mediums in Octane like a scattering medium or random walk medium. We will learn about mediums more in the material section of the course. Generally speaking, mediums control what happens when light rays go through something. Will they be scattered inside that thing and then get back out, or will they be absorbed? A volume medium here controls what happens to the light rays as they go through this medium. Will the color change? Will they be absorbed? Simply put, it adds color and other qualities to a fog volume. For example, let's come down to the scattering section. Here you notice an RGB spectrum node is connected. If I clear the RGB spectrum node, the volume will disappear in the render. So let's add a new RGB spectrum node to the scattering input. You can just click on this button and then type RGB, and this will filter out all the nodes that start with RGB. Let's add RGB spectrum. So we get our volume back. If I use a darker color in the RGB spectrum, a node, the light rays won't be scattered that much inside the volume. And if I use brighter colors, the light rays will be scattered further. I can use any other color as well, like pink or green. Now the light rays will become green when they scatter inside the volume. If we use a darker green, they will scatter less. And if we use a brighter green, they will scatter further. We will learn about the more technical aspects of these values when discussing about rendering fire and smoke and using OpenVDB files in the last section of the course. For now, let's use a pure white color for the scattering. So that is one of the ways to colorize the light shaft. Obviously, you can select the light tag and change the color of the light source itself. For example, we can make the lights more orange by lowering the temperature to something around 2500 or 2000s. And now we get this orange volumetric light shaft. It is a bit easier to control the color of the atmospheric effect if you just change the color of the light source and instead use the scattering to control how far the light rays will scatter through the volume. For now, let's change the color back to white by setting the temperature to 6500. And let's get back to the volume medium. We also have this absorption input to control what happens to the light rays in terms of getting absorbed when they enter the volume. Let me just turn off this invert absorption checkbox first. And let's change the absorption color to pure red. You notice as the light rays move away from the light source, the light rays get a cyanish color. The absorption color is set to red. So as the light rays go through the volume, the red component of their visible color will be absorbed, and we will be left with the rest of the colors, which are blue and green, which results in a cyan color. This might be a bit hard to understand for some folks, so they have this useful invert absorption checkbox. If enabled, now all the colors except for the defined color, which is red here, will be absorbed, and we will be left with the red color. Now, if I change the color to white, because of the inversion checkbox, we have black. So no color component will get absorbed, and all the rays will go full force through the volume. And if I change the color to black, because of that inversion checkbox, now we get white. So really nothing happens to the rays, and they will remain the same as they initially entered the volume. When we use the absorption or scattering in conjunction with a fire simulation, for example, we can understand these parameters better. Here I try to simplify everything so we can be able to understand and utilize these values with volumetric lighting. One last parameter I want to talk about here is this volume step length, or one of the last parameters. The value is more important when dealing with explosion, fire, and smoke simulations. In those cases, a lower value will result in more detailed showing, and a higher value will result in less detail. This controls the quality of the algorithm when solving volumes. Very low values like 0.1 will be more precise but noisier and harder to clean, and higher values will be less precise but will resolve faster. For example, if I set it to around 200, Now, because the algorithm is not that accurate, the volume will be more sparse. For now, let's set it to. We can also make sure the density is set to 0.1 and step length is at 1. So this is normally used depending on the size of the simulation. For example, a big campfire would be good with a bigger step length, but a candle flame sim needs a lower step length to bring out the details of the sim. We will learn more when dealing with those later on in the course. Also, if I get back to the generate tab, I want to quickly take a look at this edge feather parameter to see how this parameter works. Let's go to the light tag and increase the spread angle to 180 degrees. Now we can get back to the volume. Edge feather is used to feather the edges of the voxels, which will make the edges of the container to look softer and less dense. So this should cover the basics. Now we can go to the second scene for this lesson and use what we learned here and in the previous lessons to light a moody classroom scene with heavy volumetric lighting. So here we are in the classroom scene. Let me start a render in the live viewer so you can see what we have. First, let me turn off all the ceiling lamps first and also turn off the Octane sky. To begin with, we have an Octane daylight. If I select the daylight tag, I'm using the Octane daylight model because it allows me to customize the color of the sun. I'm using a reddish orange for the color of the sun with the power set to 5. The mixed sky texture is enabled so we can see the texture environment that we have in this Octane sky. If I enable it and select the environment tag, here I'm using an RGB spectrum node that gives the environment an orange color. Then I have these ceiling lamps with this Octane diffuse material named emission assigned to them. Let's turn them on. And if I open up the node editor for the material, you notice the diffuse color is set to black and a black body emission node is connected to the emission input of the material. The power is set to 10 and a green RGB spectrum node is connected to the texture input of the black body emission node. You notice the black body emission node has a light ID of 2. We will need that later on. And if I go to the Octane settings window to change a few things, first I'll lower the GI cam to 10 to make the volumetric lighting clean up faster. Then I will also lower the diffuse depth to only 2 bounces from 16. As I mentioned in the previous videos, diffuse depth controls how many times an indirect light ray can bounce in the scene from the diffuse surfaces. The default value is 16, so when a direct light ray hits a surface, it can bounce back and forth for 16 times between surfaces. I'll set it to 2 to limit the indirect bounces. I'll show you at the end how this helps us with the lighting. Let's add a new Octane fog volume to the scene. I'm going to set the voxel size to around 10 centimeters for now. And I want it to contain the entire classroom. I have this volume placement helper null to help us with that. So let me just place the volume under the null and zero out its coordinates. Now we can get it out of the null. And for the size, let's go to the generate tab, set the size on X to 970 centimeters, on Y to 320, and on Z to 860. Now it contains the entire classroom. We no longer need to see it in the viewport, so let's hide it in the viewport. As you can see from the render, the volume blocks all the lights as it is very dense. So let's go to the medium tab and lower the density to something like 0.5. Before doing anything else, I want to make sure that this volume only interacts with the sun and the environment and not the ceiling lamps. So first, let's rename the volume to something like Volume for Sun. Next, add an Octane object tag to it. Under the object layer tab, enable use light pass mask. We know the emission material applied to the ceiling lamp has the light ID of 2, so let's uncheck light ID 2 for this volume. Now you see how this volume only interacts with the daylight and the environment and not with the ceiling lamps. Later on, we'll create another volume that only interacts with the ceiling lamps. Now let's get back to the volume itself. I'm going to increase the volume step length to around 2. For the absorption color, use this orange color with the RGB values of 255, 115, and 75. For the scattering color, use this orange color with the RGB values of 223, 97, and 0. I've already explained this parameter, so I'll just show how I got the lighting done for this scene. Now let's duplicate the volume and rename it to volume for ceiling lamps. And in its Octane object tag, enable light ID 2 for it so it interacts with the ceiling lamps. But disable S and E IDs so it wouldn't interact with the daylight and the sky. Let's go to the medium tab for this volume, clear the absorption channel, and change the scattering color to a pure white color. Lower the density to something like 0.05, and now we can increase the step length to 5. And the last thing I do for both of the volumes is to select both of them and under the Generate tab, increase the edge feather to 1 to soften the volume and allow more light rays to scatter. And this should give us the final look that we want. If I get back to the Octane settings window, we can see that the diffuse depth parameter right now is set to 2. So the indirect lighting is a bit reined in. Let me just right click in the live viewer and show the render in the picture viewer. But if I increase it to the default value of 16, now we can save this render to the picture viewer. And if we compare to the previous render, you notice how this render is brighter and less contrasty. I prefer the first look, even though the second render is physically more accurate because we allowed the indirect light rays to bounce back and forth in the scene for longer. So let's set the diffuse depth to 2. Then let's add some bloom to the render. I'll select the Octane camera tag, go to the post-processing tab, obviously enable it, then increase the bloom power to around 86 and increase the cutoff to 8 so only the brightest pixels get bloomed. Then let's go to the camera imager tab and enable spectral AI denoiser. You need to enable denoise volumes so the denoiser can denoise volumes as well. We want the denoiser to be applied when the render is finished, so we can enable denoise on complete, and this would save us some processing power while the render is being done, because Octane wouldn't have to denoise the render while the render is ongoing. Then let's go to the Octane settings window and increase the max samples to something around 4000. It should be enough. Now let's go to Cinema 4D settings, increase the resolution to 1920 by 1080. Now let's start a final render to see what we get. So the render took 6 minutes and it is clean, especially if I go to the denoised pass. And here is the final render after doing some basic color correction in post. So in this lesson, we learned about fog volume and volumetric lighting in Octane for Cinema 4D. See you in the next one. Make sure to visit our website mographplus.com and check out our premium CGI and rendering courses for Cinema 4D, 3ds Max, Maya, Arnold, Octane, Corona, V-Ray, Redshift, and much more. See you in the next one.